What's up, everybody? It's Mystic Raven on ESO Daily, and I am on the public test server. I had to look up the NDA rules. They had a partial lift, so there's a lot that I'm not going to be able to cover. Nothing with Morrowind as far as any of the content. So just heads up, I can't disclose or talk about any of that. But I can talk about any change that's affecting current classes. And one of the major things that's going to be taking effect with the current class system is the champion system. So I'm going to be able to discuss this and give you guys the breakdown of some of these changes and how it's going to affect you. And today what I want to go ahead and do, guys, we're going to go over the rate difference with the current system and the changes. Now, I know a lot of people have been pushing the panic button because, resource management. I'm going to go ahead and break and give you a summary after I go ahead and break all of this down and give you what ZOS did and how it's going to benefit your playstyle, as well as kind of, take a look at some of those marginal differences. So let's get started with the mage in the apprentice and the mage tree. Okay. Now, first thing I want to go ahead and do, I'm not max CP, but I have enough to go ahead and stack. So we're going to take a look at the stacked difference. That's all we're going to go ahead and do in each tree. I'm not going to break down the diminishing rates today in each tree. But I want to go ahead and show you guys the difference of loss. All right. So, or gain. So we'll go ahead and break this down. So first thing we want to go ahead and do is go into Blast, and we're going to stack 100 into it. Very simple. Okay, so at 100, we're looking at 15%. Now we did have 25%, so we're looking at a 10% loss in Blast. So of course that's going to affect the way that damage, the heal was distributed. To me, this was kind of like, oh shit, like, because I play mainly healers. But after I went through everything, I saw what ZOS did. I will get into this, but we're looking at a 10% decrease in Blessed, and that's your healing effects. Okay? I'm going to go ahead and take this out. Okay, now we're going to go to Elfborn. We'll stack up. Okay, Elfborn remains the same at 25%. So nothing in Elfborn has changed. So the critical damage on the stack hasn't changed for Elfborn. But, I mean, we still got to take into consideration diminishing return. But Elfborn is unchanged. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and dump it down. Elemental Expert. We're going to run it up. Okay, 15%. Once again, we're looking at a 10% decrease. Okay, Spell Erosion. Okay, 5,280. We lost 1 point. So it's 5,281 prior. So it's a 1 point loss. The major thing about penetrations, right, guys? I always use my Spell Erosion or my Piercing to offset the difference of what I'm missing in my penetration. So for the devs not to change this was key, because technically, if you didn't have any sharpen, this is where you would see the sharpen rate, because the sharpen rate for two-handed weapons like 5,280, 81, or give or take. This is why you can use other traits in weapons and go ahead and use the erosion to your benefit to offset the difference. Just saying, putting it out there, technically speaking. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and go over. We're going to go into Staff Expert. Now this is amazing here, guys. So Staff expert was initially 25%. Now we get an increase by 10% for the damage for light or heavy attacks. So even though we lost damage over here between elemental expert, we've gained in our weapon experts. So we can do the same thing and we're going to get the same effect towards physical weapon expert. Okay, now if you notice, physical weapons has been changed. So there was melee and then there was bow. That's no longer the case. They went ahead and put bow into the physical weapon expert. I really like this change because now you don't have to go ahead and allocate the difference between physical and bow because of your swap, your weapon swap, and your bar swap. This was a really good plus that ZOS implemented. So once again, this was really good. This was excellent. And we're going to get the same, we should have the same effect. It should be about 35%. You see what they're doing here, guys? I want you guys to pay attention to this because when you're weaving, that damage is calculated, right? If you're spamming abilities and you don't have a good weave between your rotation, you lose DPS anyways. But as long as you go ahead and allocate enough points into your weapon experts and weave periodically, you're going to make up a significant amount of damage loss over in these other skills. So keep that in mind, man. All right, so we're going to go into Shattering Blows. Okay, I'm going to look at my sheet here. Shattering Blows was at 25. It still remains 25, so it's unchanged. Now, this is another thing I want you guys to pay attention to is the Butcher. The Butcher increases your damage done by light and heavy attacks by 5% when an enemy drops below 25%. That's significant for these two. So I want you guys to pay attention to that because it really is going to dramatically change how you effectively use your weave techniques. So keep this in mind when you're allocating your point system, depending on how you're going to build. Right? So, even though there's some changes, it's going to affect your class depending on your rotation. And to me, that's what's really nice about this setup. They're actually giving you options to go either more ability-based, more weapon-based, or a mix of the two to go ahead and use a solid rotation between your weaves. Okay, so now you see Master at Arms, and I'm sure a lot of people who's watch YouTube, Outcast had covered this, but I'm going to go ahead and cover it as well, and I'm going to get into this specific. So Master at Arms increases your damage done with direct damage attacks. Now this applies to both physical and magical direct damage. So no longer do you see, the two separated, per se. You can go ahead and allocate the points into this for both builds. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and stack it. And that's 25. Now this is interesting here, guys, because now we've lost 10% into Elemental Expert, but we gain the stack effect for the Master at Arms. Separating your dot and your direct damage. Now, I'm not saying you should be stacking, but what this actually does is diversifies your build a lot more because now you can go completely direct or you can go with a more dot end build. It's actually taking, like I said in one video, even your dot builds were built to burst. Now, this is separating that effect. This is making, more beneficial whether you're a dot build or whether you're a direct damage build or you're more burst build. So this is good shit. This is good stuff. And they said it makes it more interesting. It does because it's separating these builds. It's diversifying it a lot better. Because now when we take a look at Thaumaturge, right? We're going to put into this. We're going to see the same effect. 25%. It's unchanged. So now you can go ahead and decide whether or not you want more of a burst end, more of a dot build, or if you want a more evenly distributed build to benefit from both effects, depending on, like, if you're using Valkynscorian along with some burst effects. So if you're running dots just to proc Valkynscorian, but you want the high-end burst, you can run a build like that. Okay, so precise strikes. Now this is interesting too. This hasn't changed at all either. So precise strikes still at 25. So precise strikes and Elfborn are unchanged. Those are the crit damage values, right? So how much your crit damage is going to do. So that's interesting. It's completely interesting to me how they really did keep certain things the same. Okay, so piercing, once again, it should just be a 1 point difference. Yeah, so we're looking just 1 point difference. It's insignificant, really, 1 point. And of course, mighty should be 15% too. Okay, yeah, so we look at a 10% decrease in mighty. So it has affected your damage output with current configuration for stacked effects. The diminishing return plays effect across the board, and it is front end loaded, but it always has been. They've just put a more dramatic curve in certain trees than others, making you think, how can I make up that difference? You know, I can lower in my base end damage and make up the difference in the crit value, and thus putting more points into the weapon damage. So during my weave rotation, I can pick up that damage for my light and heavy attacks. That's, really interesting too, because when you do heavy attacks, you're sustain. You build up stamina and you build up magicka. So you're going to have to use a heavy attack between your rotations somewhere for more sustain. This is why we're losing these resource effects, because we've gotten out of hand with not using weave abilities. So we want to use it. We want to focus at least putting a heavy end attack for sustain somewhere in our rotation. And animation cancellation is going to be key to execute this. All right, so Ironclad. Okay, so Ironclad before was looking at 25%. This is 25%. Nothing's changed except the difference of it is, instead of actually break freeze, what this is doing is reducing your damage taken against direct damage attack. Okay? So there is a huge difference with Ironclad, if you haven't noticed. Okay, Spell Shield. Now, I really want you guys to pay attention to your resistance here. Okay? Going to be more vulnerable in physical resistance or physical pen. So somebody's going to wreck you with physical abilities, but then you can go ahead and I'll show you in medium armor. I can go ahead and do the same effect, stack it up, and reduce the physical resistance by 5,280. Now, resistance hasn't changed for PvP. They've kept that. They've left that alone, which is really nice. So that only affects Cyrodiil. Okay. So with Scourge or True Flame. All right. But same thing with light armor focus, guys. So we're going to look at 5,280 for physical resistance. Okay? So you can see it. So if I have a high-end spell resistance because I'm wearing light armor, I don't have enough physical resistance. I can go ahead and use this to my advantage in PvP. All right? All right. Thick Skin reduces your damage done by damage over time effects. Okay, and that's at 25%. That's kind of interesting too, because a lot of these resistance are going to take a lot more effects in PvP. In PvE, it's all about, mitigating the difference slightly, trying to just become efficient in your dungeon crawls. But for PvP, this becomes a little more interesting how you offset these differences. Now, here's the big ones that you guys are going to notice is Hardy and Elemental Defender. Okay, so we're looking at 15. It was 25. The reason I'm going to be bringing this up is for current vampires and werewolves. So prior to this change, you could negate the negative effect, right? This is no longer the case. So depending on whether you're a vampire or a werewolf, you might need, a glyph of resistance, depending if you can mitigate the amount, the 10% difference in damage taken. So it no longer overpowers werewolves or vampires. You still get the nice recovery boost, which is really good because werewolves get a recovery boost and so do vampires, which becomes very important when this update. But the question of it is how do you go ahead and take that 10% difference and mitigate that damage difference? So you might have to go ahead and take one ring and mitigate some extra damage. And same thing with Hardy. Okay. Yep. Same thing. Okay, so now we're going to look at Bastion. Now this is a big one for me because I run the DK healer, right? Everybody knows I run DK healer. And this is unchanged. And I think the devs did a great job by leaving this one alone because now as healers, since we're losing in Blessed, we have to focus in on some sort of mitigating effect, whether that be through a gear set or an ability. Now, I know a lot of people are going to be like, there's not a lot of options. There are some. And you have to understand that weaving with your resto staff becomes very important now, as well as other mitigating effects. So Bastion becomes a very important resource for healers now. So taking a couple points in the Bastion, once again, I would never suggest stacking because of diminishing return, but this becomes a key element in how many mitigating effects that you're using and how much damage you can reduce to make up the lack of healing. So because here's the thing, when you heal, if you heal over, there's no overflow of the heal difference. So as I was testing out healing, I didn't really see too significant loss in my healing effect because I'm usually healing over anyways. So it makes me a little bit more aware of my rotation and puts me in a little bit more combative type game style instead of just sitting back and hitting a couple of buttons. So the healer becomes a little bit more interesting now because now you have to pay attention to your rotation a little bit better and what abilities you're throwing out there at what times. So it's not just go ahead and it's easy mode, click click click. It's basically saying, okay, I need to pay attention to my hots now. I need to pay attention to my direct heals. I need to pay attention to what I'm doing. And I love this fact that they did this because being a healer sometimes was just, a little monotonous. So this made it a lot interesting because I was, healing over a lot of times anyways. So it makes you pay attention a little bit more and you don't really notice the loss. So trust me, healers, don't panic. You're just going to have to pay attention a little bit more. That's it. Expert Defender. Now, this one to me was really interesting because the original expert defender is 25%. Now we're looking at an increase in 35%. But notice, guys, that they increased the damage rate of the weapon abilities. So this becomes the negative. This becomes your negating effect for for PvP specifically, because if people are going to do heavy end attacks now between their rotation, you want to at least pay attention to expert defender, because people are going to go ahead and use light and heavy attacks more frequently now. So this becomes really interesting how they did this. So they really did, put this much over in the weapon expert, but they gave it a counterpart, like Outcast said. So this becomes a counterpart to that. Okay, quick recovery. Okay, so quick recovery, we're looking at 15%, and it was 16, so a loss of 1%. No biggie. So don't hit the panic button on quick recovery. And heavy armor focus should be the same thing, should be about 5,280. Yes. Now, I'm actually disagreeing on this one. Tanks are, since the changes in, for the last couple of months, tanks have been beast to kill. So now they're picking up damage in Cyrodiil. They're mitigating all this. The last thing I want to see them do is be able to negate more penetration. I actually think the devs need to adjust this one for the tanks. Tanks are a little overpowered at the moment in PvP. So me being a tank and seeing that I can just completely stack this resistance, to me, is ridiculous. It's just completely ridiculous. I can go ahead and take a set that gives me X amount of spell resistance, and use the heavy armor focus to stack the difference. So I honestly think they should change this one. And I know a lot of tanks are going to flame me for this, but really, guys, I run some tanks, and I just think it's a little much. That's my opinion, though, just for the record. Okay, so now this used to be where we had, the magician and everything for our reduce cost effects. Those are no longer effective, but guess what, guys? It's not that big of a deal as far as cost goes. I was only, it was like a couple hundred points. It wasn't like half of my friggin' cost reduction was there. So it wasn't that, whatever. Resource management becomes important now in your gear, your jewelry. So let's say you're running DPS and you have a double stack of, like, for example, I run Scathing Mage and Overwhelming Surge on my DK, right? So I have 2 DPS sets with next to nothing in regen. So now I want to go ahead and take maybe one of my jewelry slots and put, a recovery in there instead of stacking the spell damage on the jewelry. That's where you can do those type of things without dramatically affecting your build. Okay, just for the record, so people stop, pushing the panic button. They want you just to pay attention to a little bit more regen between your weave rotation and how you trait your gear and how you, glyph it and things. And I actually think it's kind of interesting now because I don't have to, bank on, pots and just stacking, X amount of spell damage and trying to get the most DPS out of my set. So now a Siphoner. Siphoner, when you deal damage with a light or heavy attack, you decrease the enemy's health, magicka, and stamina recovery by X amount of percentage for 3 seconds. This is big in PvP, guys. This for PvP is ridiculous. I mean, 3 seconds doesn't seem like a lot, but you can get up to 15%, decrease. in their regen. If they're not paying attention, if they're not making adjustments in PvP, this could hurt a lot. Especially, they made some adjustments with, they reduced the debuff, the resource debuffs, but still, with the resource debuff and this, that's pretty nasty, guys. I'm not going to kid you. That is pretty gross. That becomes very effective. You know, and you would have to go ahead and use a regen set towards your benefit if this was so. Recovery food and regen set becomes pertinent now just because of something like this. So you have to pay attention. You have to understand how you're going to make your builds. And once again, I'm going to go ahead and go back to how this affects your classes, because I'm allowed to talk about how these things can affect your class. I'm just not allowed to go ahead and talk about any of the other stuff. Okay, Sprinter. Now, this is interesting, guys, because Sprint prior was only at 24%. So now we're seeing 11% increase to reduce the cost of sprints. So now as STAM users can play more tactical without running out of STAM. They can, use the resource management in their play by using this type of stuff in PvP. So if you're running towards somebody and they're trying to get away from you, you're reducing that cost significantly now, way more than before. So STAM users, don't worry about it, man. You're actually getting a lot more perks now with your recovery towards just simple things like running. So once again, man, this becomes relevant in something like PvP. Okay, Warlord. Now, Warlord is the new Ironclad. Was the Ironclad, but now it's this. 25%. So that's interesting because now, you can reduce the cost of your break freeze more significantly. It was very low end prior to this. Now with this change, you can go ahead and break free without taking a lot of the extra stam. Once again, stamina. So this is saving you. And even Magicka users, you can reduce those costs of those CC effects more significantly. This is why I kind of like this, because they really did, take this into consideration for PvP. So, even though we lost a lot of resource management, they made up the difference, and the little things like running, break freeze, recoup unweaving, how much damage we're dealing now with our weapon attacks. This is really good, guys. It really does make it a little bit more interesting in how you utilize your build. Okay, bashing focus. Okay, so 35%, it was 25. So now tanks, guess what? You get a reduced cost of your bash, or even stam, or anybody, by an extra 10%. So once again, they've reduced that cost by 10%. So that's gone up, not down. So there you have it, guys. Little things. It's stuff like this that, makes gameplay a lot more interesting. Okay. Now we're going to go ahead and Mooncalf, stam recovery. Look away, guys. Look away. You guys are probably going to scream. 15. So it was 25. We're down by 10%. But like I said, keep in mind the effects that have gone up and reducing your cost. So that is where it becomes relevant. Okay, guys? And your heavy end attacks and things like that become more reflective now in your builds. Okay, Arcanist. Okay, no surprise, same thing. So we lost 10%. Tenacity. Okay, so tenacity was at 16, now it's at 15, so we lost 1%. Now, here's the big thing. A lot of people never focused in a lot on tenacity. If you're going to be doing weaves now, more heavy, full-blown heavy attacks, tenacity becomes a very good resource for you to now allocate points into, because now those fully charged heavy attacks are going to restore more magicka and stamina. So, and for healers, doing your heavy and resto attacks heals for a percentage of the heavy attack anyways. So tenacity, it now becomes a more focal point for your recoup. So keep this in mind, guys. Tenacity is a very relevant point placement now, more than it was before. Not saying you should stack, once again, diminishing returns and all. Okay, now we're going to take a look at healthy. And that's at 15, and healthy was originally at 25, so we lost 10% on health recovery. I know a lot of people and tanks are going to hit the oh shit button on healthy. Honestly, guys, this I think was the attempts to make up the difference for some of the tank builds that has been going on. Healthy doesn't really affect PvE as much because healing received sets make up this difference, and resistance. So even though they've lost some on healthy, this makes it a little bit more manageable to take them out in Cyrodiil. So I kind of like that they went with this. Now, if you were a stand build that was focused in on this, it kind of hinders you a little bit, but keep in mind there are sets there that will give you that healing received, and that'll make up some of that difference. And also keep in mind, guys, there's glyphs. Always. There's always a way to make up the difference. Okay. Befoul. Now, this to me is probably one of my most favorite ones. It was at 35, and now it's 55. That's 20-point increase. Okay, PvPers, pay attention, because Befoul doesn't reflect PvE at all, unless they come out with a mechanic that this becomes relevant. But debuff, on top of Befoul, depending on abilities, like Stamina Nightblade, shit. Wow. This to me was like, wow. Stam Nightblade now becomes so crazy. It just becomes crazy with this effect. Because healers, you have to take healers out in PvP. The longer a healer will stand, the longer those people are staying up. And when you hit, enemies with any damage reduction ability and Befoul applies, they're getting less heals from that healer. You hit a healer with it, now that healer is healing himself for less. That reflects the blessed as well. So healers no more can go ahead and just stand up. This really goes ahead and affects PvP. And you can use this across the board in a lot of builds with, debuffs. So poison abilities and glyphs now with debuff effects becomes very, very important. So keep that in mind. Okay, tumbling. So this reduces the cost of roll dodge. We all know what tumbling is. So now here's once again Stam. It was at 18%. Now it's gone up. Sorry, wasn't even all the way allocated to 25. So, there is a 7-point increase, 7% increase. So 7% of your reduction cost. So that's towards your benefit as well. Especially magicka users, putting a couple points into this, they really have made it to where you can reduce cost effects. You're losing resources, but now we're gaining in cost reduction in this end. So it's the opposite effect. We're losing resources, reducing cost effects. Okay. Shadow Ward. Okay, and this is the same. Now tanks, I'm sure you're going to be happy to see that. Nothing's changed in the Shadow Ward. It's remained the same. All right, so no difference there. Okay, and Shade. This is huge for everybody who PvPs. Look at this. Look at this, guys. Look at it. This is at 35, and it was at only 16, I believe, last time I checked. It's almost doubled. It's almost doubled. They've completely given us a lot more reduction in our point placement. So even though we've lost in resource, management, we've gained in reduction costs, especially for STAM users. For STAM users, the point placement now becomes completely, they can negate a lot of these negative effects that they used to have to be burdened with in the past. So even though, it was like, oh, you know what, I can deal X amount of damage and spam. They don't have to chase anybody down for a dramatic cost anymore. And you add this now with well fitted. Hello. All right, guys. So that's pretty much the CP, differences. I just wanted to do a video on this. So I'm not going to be covering a lot until I'm not actually going to cover anything else until they lift the NDA. Now, here's my summary, guys, how the classes are effective. I played around with 2 or 3 of my classes today. And Nightblade, not really affected by these changes so much. Nightblade healers, my DK has. Once again, the Magicka Dragon Knight, and I would probably say this probably also for the STAM. The STAM has a nice recovery towards their ability. So if you have a solid in rotation and you're using weaves and you're using Earth and Heart abilities, you're getting that stamina back. That's great for the Stamina Dragon Knight. It's not so much problematic. Magicka DK, they need to address this issue. So Zoss, for the Magicka Dragon Knight, it's not like it's not playable, but it is very, very much more harder on the Magicka DK because they don't have a lot of Magicka passive recovery in their passives. They don't have a lot of recovery in their passives. Every class that I play has some sort of recovery effect, okay, whether it be an ability or a passive or something. The Magicka DK so far that I've noticed is the class that's hurting the worst with these changes, guys. So hopefully Zoss will take note of this, put in something to recoup a little bit. I don't want them to do it a lot because then that becomes a class balance issue. But they need to take note that it is relevant on the Magicka DK. It is a problem. Nothing else has changed with the Magicka DK as far as its other passives and effects. Now, once again, resource management becomes important when it comes to your weaving and your heavy attacks, and you need to focus in on this a little bit more significantly. So I'm glad that some of these changes have been implemented. And I can see a lot of people, being upset about it. But really, guys, as I'm showed you, there's not a lot of things to be panicked about because they've just kind of reversed some of the gameplay effect. Because prior to this, we weren't weaving as much and we weren't focused in on our weaves. We were just trying to cancel out with the light attack and get in, a proc. That's pretty much how we were playing it. A lot of people, and I'm guilty of it on some of my builds as well. Now heavy end attacks is in tenacity, and weapon damage, direct weapon damage becomes more significant, right, guys? This becomes more significant, and especially, and it's very interesting how they put the Master of Arms in along with the weapon experts, because now when you allocate X amount of points in and you put points into this, not only does Master of Arms is going to affect your direct damage abilities, it's going to affect weaves because a weave is a direct damage effect. So when you do a weave, you're doing a direct damage effect. These two, or these two, these go hand in hand, guys. And it's interesting that they definitely put the placement there, and especially with the butcher. So I want you guys to keep notice of that. Once again, though, it all becomes on what you're trying to obtain in passives. And once again, I kind of agree with Fang Rush on this. In my opinion, they just need to do something, not because of this part per se, but this part. This is where a high-end CP players get the most benefits. Now, if you were thinking about spreading your points across the board, that's a bad idea. Because why? Because they've increased reduction in certain effects in your stamina. If you split it across the board, you're not gaining those benefits, guys. This is why you want to pay attention with point placement and in your class build and your passive a little bit more, because if you have a stam recovery, you might need to go ahead and allocate a little bit more into your magic recovery. And I know a lot of people are going to go went ahead stack the fuck out of their recovery as much as they can, because they're going to be like, well, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put all of it in Arcanist. I'm going to put all of it in Mooncalf. It's not necessarily a good idea either, because by doing that, you're going to skip out on Tenacity. Tenacity is going to go ahead and help you along with the regen. So let's say if I only have one regen in my set bonus, I can go ahead and now glyph a jewelry with a recovery. Now add that on top of what type of food I'm using, whether I'm a vampire or a werewolf, whether I'm using barrier for a healer, and then add tenacity for heavy and recovery. This becomes more significant. So stacking is going to hinder you a lot more, but you want to go ahead and take it up to a certain percentage. So let's go over this just really quick here. So 100 points is only going to get me 15%. We know this, right? It's going to get us there. So my suggestion, and this is just my suggestion, is take it... Oh, my trigger. I would take it probably down between 12 to 14%. Because the more lower I go, guys, right, I'm only losing 2% difference, right? So I'm losing, less than 2%. Now I can go ahead and put a lot more into tenacity for recovery. So I can get this up to about 7 or 8% to make up that difference. Right? And then I can go ahead and reductions or whatever I need. Now, if I have a lot of recovery, if I'm using recovery for food for PvP, I might not even use any tenacity, right? Because I might not need these passives, and I might focus in on Bafao for debuffs. That becomes a lot more, point happy. I'm going to go ahead and take in a reduction here. So I'm going to go ahead and take this up to about 30%. I'm going to go ahead and reduce that. I'm going to go ahead and reduce my sneak cost. This becomes a lot more, viable for stam users. How they're going to go ahead for point placement. Siphon too. So let's go ahead and say I'm running an all recovery with some modification. So let's say I bring this down to less than about 10%. Now I can go ahead and hit them with more of a high-end reduction, because they're not going to have all of this resources anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and even hit them harder and take away a lot more of their resources. So it makes PvP a lot more tactical, right, guys? That's what this is. It's more of a tactical approach to PvP. How you're going to approach your build. All right. So once again, and always, guys, I appreciate you watching, and thank you, Zos, for giving a partial lift on the NDA. I'm sorry, guys, that I won't be able to do it any more until I hear any news, but at least I was able to do this and let you guys know. It's so far I haven't seen a lot of impact with the current class configurations. I'm going to go ahead and work on my CP grind more, and I don't want to play with this too much because I have to gain champion points. But I'm glad that Zos, allowed me to at least cover this and let you guys know to stop hitting the panic button. All right. It definitely changes up game strategy a little bit, but it's completely doable. It is a nerf. I'm not going to say it isn't, but it's a needed nerf. Okay. So there you guys have it. I do want to thank you for watching. And once again, and always, have a nice day.